Hello, my name is Scott Neigh, and today I'm going to be talking about From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. It was published in 2016 by Haymarket Books. So this book is a mix of history and social analysis. The history looks at primarily the United States, primarily centering the experiences and especially the struggles of African American communities. Most of the history falls between the 1960s and the present, though there are bits and pieces where it looks farther back than that. And the analysis is a really forceful argument for a politics that is integrally both anti-racist and anti-capitalist. So just to talk a little bit more about the history, it looks at the ways in which the militant Black struggles of the 1960s and the early 1970s forced a bit of a retreat in the mainstream of the existing formation of white supremacy. It created space for systemic understandings of poverty, of racism, of anti-Black oppression. Then, as the street presence of movements receded in the 1970s, as the counterattack by elites took on a coherence and grew stronger, that space closed and there was kind of a reconfiguration of white supremacy to the kind of colorblind racism that's still dominant in North American mainstream discourse today. Then the book looks at the ways in which the Black freedom struggle shifted over some of those years. From the high point in the 1960s and early 1970s, where there was a significant presence of mass politics, of street-level politics, to not too many years later, as the momentum on the streets receded, a shift more towards electoral politics, a focus on getting Black elected officials in a wide range of different offices at different levels in the United States. That shift was one that was very understandable given the context. It was one that even certain elements of the radical wing of the Black freedom struggle were in favor of in the early years. But a central argument of this book is that it's one that has had limited impacts. I mean, certainly there are far more Black elected officials now in the United States than there were 40 years ago. There are certain kinds of important gains that have been possible because of that. But the argument that this book makes is that the core concerns, the core experiences, the core struggles of specifically poor and working class Black communities have not been able to be addressed by the advances that have been made on the electoral front. So then the book shifts to looking specifically at one of those core needs, core experiences of harm and violence by poor and working class Black communities in the United States, and that is the criminal justice system and mass incarceration as it has arisen in the last few decades. Puts that in the context of the longer history of the relationship between African Americans and the legal system in the United States. It then brings sort of those strands together in a chapter about the Obama administration, where it talks about the limits of what Black elected officials have been able to do to address mass incarceration, police violence, and other issues that primarily target poor and working class African American communities. Then, of course, there was the eruption on the streets that occurred because of the ways in which electoral politics were not able to address those needs, the Black Lives Matter movement, and it goes through some of the key events of that movement between when it erupted and when this book was published. And the final chapter of the book is sort of a vision chapter or a manifesto chapter, really drawing everything together to forcefully make that case for an integrally anti-capitalist and anti-racist politics. So there are lots of great things about this book. I'm glad I read it. I think lots of people who think it's important to be learning from movements and from struggles should be reading this book. And I think that's true in the Canadian context as well. Despite there being some national differences, I still think those of us in Canada have lots that we can learn from this book. I think the history that it presents is very valuable, and in fact, I think the history was what I valued the most for myself in reading this book. I really appreciated the way that it allowed me to rethink some of the things about the conventional left narrative of the post-war years and the neoliberal era by centering struggles against white supremacy and against anti-blackness. I really appreciated the history that it presented of the Black freedom struggle in the years after the 1960s, because I think lots of us who are engaged with movements but are not directly connected to those communities don't necessarily know much about how things have happened since the 1960s. So I think that's really important history to know. I also think that it is a really timely intervention in arguing for that integrated anti-racist, anti-capitalist politics. The politics that it advances and the analysis that it advances isn't necessarily new. It's certainly the core ideas are ones that I've encountered before and in other places, but I think it's really timely given how the electoral dynamics in the United States have fostered this really toxic, really destructive situation where, at least in some elements of public discourse, in some people's minds, there's some kind of opposition, essential opposition between anti-capitalism and anti-racism. And so I think it's really important that this book argues that those are of necessity. If we want our movements to be winning things, they have to be integrated, and we have to have a politics that addresses both of them simultaneously. I think my main disappointment with the book, despite my regard for that analysis and how timely I think it is that last chapter where it presents kind of a manifesto and a vision of those politics. And that's not because I don't think those politics are important. They are. We need to be talking about them. We need to be pushing back against that tendency to pull anti-racism and anti-capitalism apart. But the way that last chapter does it is, at least for me, at least in my reading, it feels a bit rigid and a bit narrow. I think that while I certainly understand why the book might want to focus on a particular understanding of white supremacy and anti-blackness, and a particular understanding of how that is integral to capitalism, I really think that there are other analyses that are valuable and important too, and other politics that flow from those other analyses about how to challenge white supremacy and anti-blackness and how to challenge capitalism. And I think that it's important, at least for me and for the movements that I'm connected to hold on to a more synthetic kind of approach of engaging with those different approaches and learning from them and taking up what we can in our own choices as we move through the world and work to change the world. I think that that this book seems kind of dismissive of some scholarly ways of approaching white supremacy and anti-blackness that I think, despite having limits, are still important and I still think we should be engaging with. There are certain other kinds of radical black analyses of white supremacy and anti-blackness that are a bit different than this book's, that it seems to be kind of dismissive of, that I don't think I can afford to be dismissive of, and other things like that. And maybe to put a bit of a finer point on it, I would argue that white readers of this book in particular need to be cautious in how we take it up. I could easily see white anti-capitalists using this book to kind of deflect anti-racist criticism of some of our organizing work, particularly if that criticism doesn't use left language. And I really think we need to avoid using this book in that way. And I could also see white anti-capitalists using this book to deflect the need to engage with some of those other ways of understanding white supremacy and anti-blackness that aren't as immediately consistent with our existing anti-capitalist analysis. Again, I don't think we should be doing that. I think we need to be engaging with that, despite there being maybe a bit more of a disconnect, a bit more discomfort on our parts. So those caveats and provisos, specifically with how white readers might take this book up, I think it's tremendously important. I think lots of people need to be reading it, and I hope that you will read it too. So, if you are interested in this book, I did a written review of it as well, and I went into quite a bit more detail in the written review, so that is linked down below. You can also find all of my social media presence down below, so check that out if you're interested, including Talking Radical Radio and all the ways that you can listen to that. And I encourage you to click like and subscribe if you've liked what I had to say today. My name is Scott Neigh, and I hope I will be back soon with another video.